campus. They've all been vetted. Also, organizations like Sunrise Movement, 350.org, those are established groups that have been around a while, Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, that sort of thing. But you really do have to be careful. It's a great question. In the era of the internet, don't take anything at face value. There are two questions here. How do you go about balancing voting for candidates who are more likely to bring about environmental change and the fact that they may be doing, horrible things themselves, since we're stuck with the two-party system? Yeah, I know. I think it's a really good question because, as you note, I and many other people say that the number one thing you can do here for the climate crisis is to vote. But then how do you know, the candidate you're voting for? We just have two candidates. Yeah, the only thing I would say, and I've said it before, is we now have viable, very green candidates. The obvious sort of older example is Bernie Sanders. The newer example is AOC, and there are many more too. They're just the ones that have gotten the limelight the most and all. So I think you can, and I think that they will do things that are probably consistent with what you may care about. But then another person asked a question, almost in response to what I just said. All of these changes seem rational to us sitting in this room in a very progressive part of the country. These nonetheless would be considered revolutionary to the point of condemnation by a lot of people in the US, even those within the Democratic Party, due to massive right shift of our political parties. How realistically do you think we could ever get candidates in office that would shift that? And again, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and others, they're there. But it is a problem. I mean, this is one of the issues in this country, and especially, so even you get, wouldn't it be wonderful, AOC as president one day? Well, yeah, but, and you may actually get the House of Representatives, given the way it works, but the Senate with two, representatives from each state, and many states being fiercely against climate change. Yeah, that would be tough to get the policies through. As you may know, Barack Obama was very pro climate change legislation, put forth cap and trade, even though it's kind of an inadequate thing. But at the time, it was something, and yet he wasn't able to get anything through the Congress that he was dealing with. And you saw that in Merchants of Doubt or Climate of Doubt. So I mean, it's absolutely right, but it doesn't mean you have to feel defeated with respect to this. In other words, just because it may be difficult doesn't mean you shouldn't continually vote and encourage other people to vote, because the tide is changing, and your generation is the one that is, the only one capable of doing the change. Okay, so here we are, lecture for today. So have you ever wondered this question? Why and when Americans became rampant consumers? Consumerism has this huge environmental and climate footprint, and absolutely huge. So it's worth pausing on this question. But before we do, let's get to that first iClicker poll, which again is the same one from last time. We'll see if people recall the right question. So according to that book that we read, which again was produced by the fossil fuel industry and its affiliates, what is the most important fact about climate science? So people are thinking about it, questioning it. Yeah, we had the answer before. This is the exact same question. Okay, so let's see where we are. It is indeed B. But if you didn't get that right, well, all the more reason to review this material, because questions like this will be on the exam, and then will be about the readings that we have, the films that we've had, and the various documentaries that we've had. So just to put it in a historical perspective, unchecked consumerism is going on for a very long time. If you were in the fall course, English 22, you know that we read a blistering attack on consumerism by the English writer Sir John Denham, almost 400 years ago. And he's hardly the first. But US consumerism was really ramped up in the 70 years separating us from the Second World War. 1945, 1950, right around there. And it is not coincidence. I think there's a causal relationship here, just to be clear. It is not a coincidence that the same period of time we call the Great Acceleration, as humanity's impact on the planet, including and notably in the form of climate change, greatly accelerated during this period. If you remember, during the 70-year period, between 85 and 90% of all greenhouse gases were emitted into the atmosphere. This is the same point in time when consumerism went up, when Americans especially began consuming a lot more stuff and supersized everything. So I mentioned size of houses has gone up like 2.7 times since 1945. And houses are literally, 2.7 times bigger than they were back then. We're now buying, 60 plus items of clothing every year. And in general, consumerism has just been massively accelerated since then. The interesting thing to think about here is that radical cultural change is a really interesting phenomenon, because once it takes place, you kind of quickly adjust to the new normal. So if you're born in an era where things have changed, all eras are like this, it generally doesn't seem unusual at all. As it's all you've ever known. The new normal is simply normal. So what do I mean by this? We're born into this hyper-consumer society. It seems normal. This is the way we're born into it. It seems normal to buy things, shop online, create, buy an enormous amount of things. Everyone else does it. It's just the very normal. But if you're caught at a moment when those cultural changes are happening, and we are incidentally in a whole range of ways right now, culture is undergoing massive transformation in the last decade in general. But if you're caught in that moment, you have this interesting vantage point because you can see it clearly because normal is changing. What was this, the baseline you grew up with is beginning to change a lot. You can see that in different ways now. And people often will react strongly one way or another. They're either going to be pro for the new world coming into being or reactionary, and they want to just keep it the way it was. And I mention all this because the person who wrote the reading for this week, Vance Packard, was there when consumerism really took off in the 1950s. And he was a particularly keen observer of American culture. He published a scorching indictment of the change that he saw happening, which is what we're reading, called The Waste Makers. And why I mention this thing, and it was, by the way, I mentioned here a bestseller, people were talking about it, it sort of entered the ethos of American culture that consumerism was a problem, and this would get taken up. The book is published in 1960, but throughout the 60s, it's getting taken up, and it comes into popular culture, the indictment of consumerism. So you may know the Rolling Stones song, "I Can't Get No Satisfaction." That's about consumer satisfaction. The person imagined in the song, sung by Mick Jagger, is saying about how he tries to buy these things, and he's not buying. He's bewildered by the consumer culture. So Packard, again, is interesting. He's not an environmentalist per se. And in a way, environmentalism in a modern sense doesn't kick off until 2 years after this book, which is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which we read part of in English 22. But The Waste Makers, from its title onward, focused on consumerism as a culture defined by the production of waste. And that's something we don't always think about. You think of consumerism, you think about it's the stuff, right? It's the stuff you want to buy, the stuff that's it's advertised, the stuff that you get. But Packard wants to focus on the fact that we don't think about what happens to all this stuff. Everything you've ever purchased gets discarded and becomes waste. And it's, as he argues, it's a waste machine. That's what you think. That's what we're engaged in. And it's interesting, I just saw, I was on YouTube and I saw an ad, I don't know why it popped up for me, but a new, supposedly environmentally more sound toothbrush. And they noted in it that every toothbrush that you have ever had since childhood is still in the world. All those toothbrushes that you throw away as waste, they're still in the world. They were created and, dozens of them just became waste. And everything does. We don't think about that. We just think about having it and all. But the very fact that you consume it means you consume it and then it goes out the other end. It's waste. So It's suggested by the word consumerism is the process of consuming stuff and eventually discarding what we have consumed as waste. Americans were increasingly being encouraged to both. Hold on, sorry about that. Yep. Okay. And here, Americans were increasingly being encouraged to both consume more stuff and to discard it more quickly, hence the title of the book, The Waste Makers. And that other point is a good one here. It's not just consuming more, but consuming quickly, more quickly. So in other words, people may have had things that, like you have a jacket, it may have lasted a decade or more prior to this, but part of the project here, because remember, the true goal from the point of view of marketers is to sell more stuff. So maybe you buy 64 items of clothing a year, but then maybe you'll just say, my closet's not big enough. Well, it has to go out of fashion so that you have more room. And to do that, it has to be cycled through quickly. And the whole process here is to get us to cycle through quickly, to consume a lot, consume quickly. So Packard is interesting because he was born in 1914 and he matured during this period that you may have heard of, maybe from your grandparents, the Great Depression. And normal to him, remember, we're born into like a culture, we see what that culture is as normal. Normal to him meant consuming something as completely as possible before discarding it. So you might have a jacket, it might be worn for many years, even a decade, and sure, it'll become frayed. It will, need repairs along the way, but you don't need to consume a lot of jackets. This was the world he was born into. So consumption was at a much lower level, and the idea of cycling it through quickly, consuming and discarding, making waste, was at a much slower pace. But then, that's the normal for him. And then he sees this new world coming to be in the late 40s and 50s. And, that meant that you'd keep a jacket for a fraction of the time, right? And we'd have to get sold on the idea that a jacket that's frayed or torn has to be gotten rid of. We have to get sold on the idea that a jacket that's a year or two old has to get rid of because it's not in style anymore. And you can see the early roots of fast fashion here. So it's all, from Packard's point of view, fashion is picking up speed in the sense that we're buying more and consuming very quickly. And in a way, the logical conclusion, at least right now in 2024, is fast fashion. If it continues, I don't know what will happen next. I mean, let's hope a counterforce comes into effect and changes it. But fast fashion, at least from our perspective, seems like the ultimate realization of this goal of getting people to consume a lot. So how do you do that? You lower the cost so you can buy a shirt for $5 or $10 and consume quickly. How do you do that? Well, get people to, with more than 2 fashion seasons a year, where we have maybe one every week, and things go out of style so quickly you have to get rid of them, and also get people buying impulsively. So something like 20% of the clothes that we buy now never actually get worn. I mean, they get worn once if you're in a store buying it, or worn once if you order it online, you put it on, see if you like it, but then never again. And in part because we're encouraged to make impulse purchases that we would later regret by not wearing the things. So the garment industry, textile industry, which is what fuels the Industrial Revolution, it really pioneered this model. That's why we call it fashion, right? So we call garments fashion. We call the industry. You don't usually call it the textile industry or the garment industry. We call it the fashion industry, and it underscores that it is the model of fashion, of things coming into fashion, going out of fashion. But what Packard realized right away was all sorts of industries were jumping on the fashion bandwagon. So cars could become fashionable. They could go out of fashion in 2 or 3 years. Houses could become fashionable. In this period, 1950s and 60s, suddenly a model of suburban houses, which were often one or two or multi-level, and this is a bi-level house and all, that became fashionable. That mid-century look that people are kind of nostalgically liking now, that came on the scene then. And it's interesting to think about all sorts of things being fashionable. Consumer electronics is fashionable. You can spot a phone from a few years ago very quickly. And this is all done because this notion of getting you to consume more was brought into being by the garment industry, and then fashion became the driving force behind it. So the automobile is a prime example. The car that Packard would have grown up with in the 1920s and 30s would have been this ubiquitous Model T, which famously came in just one color. And that's not quite exactly true, that it never changed over the period of time, but that's neither here nor there. The notion was that you'd have a car, that you'd buy a car, and a decade later, they'd be selling the same exact car. Same color, same car, no big changes and all. The automobile industry right away realized that Ford which had become very successful as a company, were incapable of being assaulted here because they could take a cue from the fashion industry and make cars that did go in and out of style. So people were told, well, you should get tired of your old car. Other companies suddenly started making cars that were different every 2 or 3 years. And Vance Packard notes that by the time he's on the scene, that's the industry. Even Ford had, abandoned that idea of a car that never changed. And instead, you have cars that are fashionable, and you see that today. And you can, as easy as you can spot a phone from a few years ago, it's much easier, in fact, if you pay attention to it, to spot a car from a few years ago. If you don't pay attention to that, which I actually don't, then it's kind of confusing, because I'm not sure if this is a new car. If I see a car, if it's different, if it's a new car, slightly new car, or whatever. But people who are encouraged to get into the system know it quite well, and people who are into fashion know it quite well. If you don't pay attention to fashion, you might not spot something from 3 years ago, but if you pay attention to it, which is the goal of the fashion industry, to get you to do that, you're going to do it. And again, this is now everywhere. Cars are a good example. Vance Packard talks about things like appliances in kitchens. Those are an example. Appliances have gone through different colors and different styles, right? Recently, the style became on the scene was to shift over to stainless steel. Everyone has stainless steel appliances. If you paid attention now, a shift is happening to a slightly darker shade of stainless steel, and people are encouraged to get rid of their appliances and not keep them. And if you have appliances from a long time ago that are like, brown or harvest gold or avocado, that was the fashion at one point. It was the height of fashion, but now that's changed. Everything is changing. And Packard notes that, all this creates waste. And he also notes that the car would be a good example, that the idea is not just, so what do you do when you get to the point where everybody has a car? Well, then what you have to do is sell everyone a second car. That's the notion behind it. And he talks about how how different industries tried to use that model. So houses that were actually pretty successful. At this period of time, everyone wants a vacation house. They want a separate house where you can go to for part of your life. Everyone wants things, Packard notes that they tried to push things like everyone would have 2 refrigerators. And the idea is, of course, not that people need 2 refrigerators, but to sell people on the idea of 2 refrigerators. That didn't necessarily work very well. But different industries kept trying all this to get you to buy more and more that you needed. And ultimately, like from our point of view, more waste, but in a way that Packard didn't really see, more emissions too. All these things have embedded carbon in them, in the sense that you make a refrigerator or a car, it takes a lot of carbon is released to do it. To produce a car, for example, somewhere between 11 metric tons for like a smaller economy car to a larger SUV. And I think the study I recall reading was on the Range Rover, which has 35 metric tons of emissions. So it's not just that you're creating, waste in a traditional sense of like point source pollution, but some of that waste, a lot of that waste are emissions. Pretty much anything you buy has to have corresponding CO2 or some sort of greenhouse gas emissions to make it. Not everything, many things. But then here's the argument. Is that really as bad as it sounds? Aren't the needs of individuals and corporations arguably both served when they provide us with stuff? In other words, isn't it a win-win for people and corporations? The problem is that time and time again, corporations have chosen their needs over consumers, often with horrific results. So we'll look at an example here, but the idea, and you'll hear this again and again, an industry pumps this out, in whatever industry, again and again. Well, people need stuff and they supply it. And this is the way it's always been. If you've needed clothing 300 years ago, maybe it was done locally, maybe there was a tailor in your town that made it, but they're just kind of ramping it up and doing the same thing. It's a symbiotic relationship, a mutually satisfying relationship. That's the way they see it. But let's look at an example. So since the 1920s, scientists have known that there was a link between smoking cigarettes and cancer. 1930s, it became very clear. By the 1950s, the American public, in a really broad way, was alerted to the problem through a series of articles in the Reader's Digest, which was an incredibly popular magazine at the time. And the article series was called Cancer by the Carton. By the end of the 1960s, it was clear to everyone, and everyone who would buy a pack of cigarettes, because that's when they first started putting the labels on the side of cigarettes. If you've seen a pack of cigarettes, it said the initial one, cigarette smoking can cause lung cancer and heart disease. I think that was the initial one. There are variations along the way. There are variations of that label in different countries. I think in Germany, it just says cigarettes kill, which is right to the point. But anyhow, by the end of the 1960s, everyone knew that this industry was selling a poison that was addictive. So what did the company do then? Knowing that they were selling a poisonous substance that was moreover addictive, what did the industry do? Did they, as you might think they would have done, horrified to realize what they had been in the business of doing, apologize to the public and immediately stop? That would be you would think, the moral, natural judgment, thing to have done. But no, they doubled down, denied the science, started producing counter science, which again we've seen with the climate crisis, and did everything they could to continuing profiting from extraordinary human suffering for as many decades as possible. So it's always going to be the go-to example, because here it was, an industry that knew that it was doing something problematic for many, many decades, going back to the 1920s, and being made a public problem, and still they decided to market it and continuing marketing it very in a ramped up way. So I don't know if anyone has seen the show Mad Men or so. I saw the first couple episodes because the first episode was so moving, because it was about this issue. It was about how they could continue to sell tobacco in an era where everyone knew that it was a problem. And you see a bunch of probably accurate, older white men sitting around a table, all coughing horribly because they're all smoking themselves, figuring out how they could continue to do this, how they could continue to sell it on the American public. And if you saw that pilot episode, they figure out the answer. And I won't give it away in case you want to watch it. It must still stream from somewhere. Even today, when you have a successful campaign that has reduced cigarette smoking in the United States over the past few decades, and that would really be beginning in the early mid-1990s, even today, 500,000 people still die in the US. And if you do smoke, and you smoke for, a significant part of your lifetime, you're going to take 10 years off of your life. Those are the statistics, and something to think about if you smoke, especially I know vaping's a thing now. But it gets even worse, and I mentioned this, but as a first pass, but I'll say it here again. So in 1987, 35 years after the article on Cancer by the Carton made Americans aware of the fact that cigarettes killed, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco launched its Joe Camel campaign for its Camel brand of cigarettes, which featured a hip and friendly cartoon camel named Joe. Joe Camel. 4 years later, an article in the Journal of the AMA, American Medical Association, revealed that this cartoon camel had been nearly as recognizable to 6-year-old children as Mickey Mouse. So why did the company do that? What would be the reason? Well, a third of all cigarettes illegally sold to minors at this time were, you guessed it, Camels. So children were still smoking cigarettes. They could still buy them openly. I mentioned like cigarette machines. And if they were reaching for it, they already had a brand identity. And that was through this Camel character, Joe Camel. So, astonishingly, the tobacco industry got into the business of making consumers out of children. I've mentioned it before, how children are from a very young age targeted and made into consumers. And in the companion lecture for this week, the one on the documentary, The True Cost, I give an example of that in some length. But the idea here is not like you're getting children to get interested in a brand of cosmetics or clothing or something like that, but you're trying to, target it openly, addict children to a substance that will take 10 years off of their lives. And the reason for it is just to keep profits up. So if you think that, where I started, that the interest of people and the corporation selling us the stuff are, synonymous, they fit together or dovetail or whatever. In this case, it's clearly not. This was in no one's interest to buy this product, but it was entirely their interest to keep selling it. It's a very high profit product that they were selling, and they pulled out all stops to continue doing it. So it's not that every corporation is this bad, but it does draw attention to a system like this if unchecked. And the answer to this, by the way, it's quite simple. If you have had a stronger government, would have stepped right in and said, you're not going to prey on our citizens this way. We are going to stop you from selling this product. We're going to make sure that everyone you've gotten addicted to it, that they're going to have that issue will have to be addressed. And ultimately, that happened in a slightly watered down way in the 1990s, where advertisement and all had to stop and things like that. But anyhow, just to be clear, corporations, will do extraordinary things, even this extraordinary, to continue to keep profits up. And they are very much in the business of creating consumers. So the need may not be there, but they create desire, which we'll talk about. Not all corporations are as evil as the tobacco industry. It's a good example as it reveals that unchecked, corporations have been willing to do extraordinary things in the name of profits and preserve their industry, even knowingly kill people by the millions. And it's always one that will get yoked with the climate crisis, because we're in the same situation today. People by the millions now are dying because of the climate crisis. A number of people died this weekend because of the storm here, and the corporations that are principally behind it are doing everything they can. You've seen it in Merchants of Doubt. You saw it in reading the book, Why Climate Scientists Disagree About Global Warming. They're doing all they can to continue profiting by their industry, even though, and this will be, I would argue, with, decades from now, when another professor is sitting up here talking about it, the go-to example for this will not be the tobacco industry. The go-to example for this will be the fossil fuel industry, because what they're doing is going to, as extraordinary as it sounds, make the tobacco industry pale by comparison. Just the sheer scope of it and the way it's impacting everyone globally. So the tobacco industry could only dream of getting, everyone across the planet smoking. Many people on, low to moderate income countries just couldn't afford it. But in this case, the fossil fuel industry will cause enormous harm to those individuals, because they're going to be most impacted by the climate crisis, even though they did virtually nothing to cause it. So the publisher of The Wastemakers notes that this is an expose of the systemic attempt of business to make us into wasteful, debt-ridden, permanently discontented individuals, and how the rapid growth of disposable consumer culture was degrading the environment, financial, and spiritual character of American society. Yeah, such a strong statement, but it's pretty much spot on. This is an attempt by business, by corporations to make us wasteful. Sure, because we're encouraged to buy, briefly use, and dispose of things. Debt-ridden, sure, because as you may know, Americans go into debt to do this. It's not just that we spend all the money we have, people are encouraged to go into credit card debt and to spend even more than they have. Permanently discontented, it doesn't work for anyone. Many people wish they could buy the things on offer and feel discontented because of it. And even people who have it wind up who buy so much are discontented by it. And it is degrading the environment, the financial and spiritual character of American society. So as bad as the tobacco industry sounds, selling this, this poison to the American public, this, according to Vance Packard, has an even greater impact on the American public, on individuals. It may not be killing you directly in a lot of ways, but it's causing all these other issues, both to us individually, to us as a culture, and of course to the planet and all the other beings that we share it with. Okay, so we had this one before. Give it to you again. So what is confirmation bias? Again, this is important. The last example came from the reading, as I recall. This example comes from the lectures. So the material that I talk about here, or the material that's on the pre-recorded lectures, could all be on the exam. But the good news is, of course, all the lectures are now up. The ones I delivered here are now on the website, and probably later today I will put this one up on the website so you can review all this. So people remember this one? They do. It is, in fact, the act of only acknowledging opinions and facts that align with your prior beliefs. And it's very important because it's used by climate change denial folks to get us to align with what they're selling. Okay. So I really am curious to hear what you think of the waste makers. And in particular, and people have commented on this, the various types of planned obsolescence that Vance Packard outlines. He also weighs in on an issue that I take up in discussing the film, The True Cost, and that is just who is responsible for this, which is a problem for us and also wrecking the planet. Is it us or is it consumers? Is it us, the consumers, or is it the people selling us the stuff and encouraging us to consume? You've already got the idea. I think it's the latter. I think, and that's why I think this is an important point, because with something like minimalism, you could say, well, yeah, but it's all turns to the individual to do it. An individual should be the one minimizing and all. Yeah, I think instead we have to look at the people selling us this stuff, manufacturing the desire. I think personal action is good. I mean, Thoreau is onto something. The minimalist folks are onto something. But I do think that the central problem here is in the manufacturing of desire and of consumers by the people who desire to sell us all this stuff. Vance Packard, in case you found this interesting, you can read the whole book. It's available online for free. And he continued publishing books. One, I think, that is also in a Cardassian era relevant today. And that book was called The Ultra Rich: How Much is Too Much? So instead of focusing on the corporation selling all this, he focuses on the people consuming more and more and more. And this is just in that decade, the 1980s, where rampant consumption was really gearing up. So it's not just that it was since the Second World War, but the idea of super wealthy individuals, the free market system, and getting to where we started with this class, where the 1% controlling so much of wealth on the planet and causing so much environmental devastation as a byproduct of that. I want to quote from something here. It's in 1955 article. So this goes back, how many years is that? 70 years ago? And it's called Price Competition in 1955. And it's by a person called Victor Lebel. And it's in the Journal of Retailing. So he is a retail analyst. He is an economist, but he's not a scholar. He's not critiquing consumerism here, but rather is offering advice to corporations on how products need to be marketed. And when you read it, remember that, because it sounds like something a scholar would have written, telling about the horrors of what consumer culture is like, what corporations should do. But he's actually advocating for this. He thinks that this is what companies should do. He's putting it in a journal of retailing so that businesses, when they're trying to figure out how to retail more effectively, will know exactly how to do it. And here's his take on it. And it is, well, you tell me what you think it is. Victor Lebow. Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek out our spiritual satisfactions, our ego gratifications in consumption. The measure of social status, of acceptance of prestige is now to be found in our consumptive patterns. The very meaning and significance of our lives today is expressed in consumptive terms. The greater the pressure upon the individual to conform to safe and acceptable social standards, the more does he tend to express his aspirations and his individuality in terms of what he wears, drives, eats, his home, his car, his patterns of food serving, his hobbies. He uses the male pronoun there, but actually we knew at the time that corporations are very much in 1955 targeting women too, because they were doing a lot of purchasing for families. But let me continue with Victor Lebow. These commodities and services must be offered to the consumer with a special urgency. We need things consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced, and discarded at an ever-increasing pace. We need to have people eat, drink, dress, ride, live with ever more complicated and therefore constantly more expensive consumption. As we examine the concept of consumer loyalty, we see that the whole problem of molding the American mind is involved here. Yeah, it's a remarkable statement. In many ways, way back in 1955, Lebow provided a mission statement for modern consumerism. I mean, this is it. Note that there's nothing here about providing superior services or making better products or serving the consumer. Instead, he focuses in a chilling way on that last line in molding the American mind. How do you make consumers? With the goal, and that I'm quoting here again, the very meaning and significance of our lives has to be expressed in consumptive terms. All meaning, all value of a person, the goal here is to make that yoked consumerism. You have to consume to find significance for who you are. So what's the role of marketers here? It's not when you're marketing something, when you're pushing a brand, it's not to extol the product on offer. It's not to say if you buy this cleaning product, it does a better job. But it's rather, in Victor Lebow's mind, to exert pressure upon the individual to conform to safe and acceptable social standards through the act of consumption. And if you see this as a mission statement, start thinking about ads that are pushing you to buy things. What is it about? Is it about telling you it's a good product, or is it about exerting all these pressures on your very sense of ego identity? Many people in the class were sort of horrified when they read about this. So I'm going to do the class discussion part now. Same as before, some are paraphrased and all, but I mean, nothing's paraphrased, but I do correct some typos here. Okay, this is now a comment. Thus, the challenge was to develop the public that would always have an appetite as voracious as a machine. So this person is quoting from Vance Packard. What a sickening line. The American public is being convinced by the manufacturing and advertising industries to purchase items in order to ensure the wheels of production are never still. This is completely backwards to how production and consumption should work, especially if you look at it from an environmental point of view. Great point, which we are. Before mass production, most goods were made as needed. If you needed a dress, you got fabric and made it, or went to a clothing maker and put it on order. Now we aren't even sure if we need another dress, but we probably do, right? Because look at all the cute ones that are on the online ads, ready to purchase right now. In what feels very related to last week's minimalism and Walden content, the manufacturing and advertising industries have completely warped our sense of desire for material goods. I think that's an exact way to look at it. That has warped our desire and need. And the end game for marketers, and this person really hits on it, is to warp our desire for material goods. So as this person notes, the way the consumption worked historically was largely based on need. And need is the idea here. If you need it, a dress, as this person says, I'm quoting from them again, you got the fabric, made it, or put it on order and have someone made it for you. However, need is now greatly overshadowed by desire. Need is not driving this kind of consumerism. Desire is. And in other words, do we really need that new dress or whatever it is on offer? Is it needed or not? The answer is generally no. But that doesn't mean that we still don't desire it. And so where does the desire come from then? I mean, need comes from, if you don't have a raincoat and you're out this weekend, you need a raincoat. Fair enough. But, do we desire all these things? Where does it come from? And that's from marketers. Their job is, as much as it is to make products, their job is to make consumers. And how do you do that? By making desire. Desire is a huge part of what you're making. And to make it where there may be little or no need. So, Victor Lebow suggests that just in case desire is not sufficiently motivating, there's another aspect of this, that marketers need to exert pressures on the individual to conform, so that he imagines his, male consumer, as a typical consumer, as, quote, to express his aspirations and his individuality in terms of what he wears, drives, to eat, his home, his cars, patterns of eating, his hobbies, etc. So it's really simple enough, right? If you purchase what we need, marketers would just sell a fraction of what they could otherwise. And that's largely because of the system that is based on industrialization, which came with the Industrial Revolution. And as we see in the documentary this week, The True Cost, it's also based on the, largely unchecked exploitation of workers. So all sorts of companies are in the business of making desires. Although it may sound odd, from fashion industries to pet food, automobile manufacturer, first and foremost, they're in the business, all those industries, different though they may be, in the business of manufacturing desire. Without it, they would be decimated. Without desire, if it was just fueled by need, it would be very quickly. So, you bought a new shirt, well, that shirt could last you years. You could repair it, you could refashion it by dyeing it again, you could turn it into another item of clothing. And that was what people traditionally did. But now you have to have desire. And what Vance Packard notes is that there's another, even darker side to this. So desire is the thing that we hope gets people to do it. That's the nice thing. If we're talking about a carrot and the stick, that's the carrot. That's something good. You desire, you want to have it. But it has a less pleasant counterpart, as we are, and Victor Lebow was really keen on this, we're hardwired to conform to the norms of a group, which the group we belong in. In this case, manufacturers are not just manufacturing desire, but engineering social pressure on the individual in order to make them consume. So, for example, by quickly shifting fashion trends, whether it's a garment or any other kind of fashion, the goal here is to be embarrassed by wearing, a shirt from last year, and which would mean that they should discard it and get a new one right away. So it's not so much that, it's not that you just want the thing because of desire, you think you actually need it, but you don't. But there's the flip side. Okay, you're not going to buy into those ads. You're not going to do it. You're not going to buy, new fast fashion every few weeks. But then the goal is social pressure will get exerted on you, because fashion trends, which people are obediently following, set by the manufacturers, if you're not doing it, then you're going to have to suffer that pain of being, sort of looked down upon by the group by not conforming to those standards. And as everybody knows firsthand, social pressure is a powerful thing. Everybody wants to fit in. Nobody wants to be an outcast. So this is a truism of human nature, right? But marketers are turning this into a powerful force to be used. So, and if you don't consume enough and you don't do it correctly, and fashion has all sorts of very correct rules that you have to follow. Again, whether it's a garment or whether it's a car, if you do it right, the promise is you'll fit in. If you make a lot of money and you buy that new car, you're going to fit in. Everyone's going to like it, and the really twisted thing is you're going to hope people will actually envy you, which is a whole other issue we won't talk about. But if you don't do it, if you don't have the things on offer, the risk is that you'll be an outcast. And again, regarding whether you actually need this thing, regarding whether you actually need to buy that particular garment on offer, that's irrelevant. Need is been so far pushed aside. It is all either desire for it or fear that you will be an outcast without it. It's very simple human nature, but it's very powerful. Next comment. But the American economy has been built on the notion that a healthy economy is one that grows due to increased consumption. In order to prolong this unsustainable economic path, the entire advertising industry was created. This all feels so artificial. What makes The Waste Maker such an uncomfortable read is the fact that it simply explains that many of our desires are not actually our own. It's a great point. They're a product of an economy and a culture that excels in shaping desires and inventing scenarios and fads that draw the attention of our wallets. If being mindful of your consumption for the sake of the environment isn't for you, maybe being mindful for the sake of acting on what you actually want is. That's a really great point. And it nicely dovetails with our previous one, especially the observation that from the previous one that the reason here that The Waste Maker is an uncomfortable read is the fact that it simply explains many of our desires are not our own. And this is rightly a disconcerting thought, right? And we tend to think that basic emotions like desire originate with us, that our desires are this deeply private thing in us. And it's really disturbing to think that what you think is primarily, basically, privately yours is in fact manufactured elsewhere out of you. And again, if this were being done for the good of the consumer, it might be less worrisome, right? In other words, if the marketers if they had our best interest at stake, right? Say they were trying to develop a desire for healthy and inexpensive food, that might be more acceptable. I mean, it's still disconcerting to think about the manufacturing desire, but at least then you could say, well, at least maybe somewhere in there's not a twisted morality, but maybe there's a reason for it. But Thoreau realized this 150 years ago, and he came out and boldly said it. Their interests are not our interests. Their interests are those of the corporation, not the consumer. And you see this with something like soda companies, right? Another great example, sell us branded sugar water that's neither healthy nor inexpensive. I mean, it's just the opposite. There's no one is served by buying, expensive sugar water. It's not good for you. That's why, like the WHO, the World Health Organization, is urging global action to curtail consumption of sugary drinks, as they can be a major factor in increasing all sorts of problems with people, maybe most notably diabetes. The problem is that, and this is kind of like the tobacco industry, that the corporations selling sugar water are so large and so profitable that they've been very successful at maintaining their health and their prosperity, even though it is at the cost of the health of individuals that they're selling it to. And you might think, well, why am I bringing up this example? It's not like a big deal. Soda water is not that big. So I looked it up. The 5 biggest corporations, wealthiest corporations on the planet, you're not going to be surprised by this. They're all high tech. There are 4 of the 5 are U.S. companies. Number one, Apple. Number 2, Amazon. Number 3, Microsoft. Number 3, Google. No surprise there. Number 5, Samsung, which is a South Korea company. What is surprising is that the number 6 most valuable company on the planet is Coca-Cola. And again, they're all about the business of selling desire. And And the other great thing about this particular comment is it talks about how our economy is built on the notion of unending growth, which is, of course, fueled by consumerism. The problem is, and we're going to get to this when we get to REAP 10 and we start looking at our individual carbon footprints and seeing what is required to support it. We do not have the resources on this planet at this point to have this level of consumerism by a broad swath of the 8 billion people on the planet. Full stop. You're going to see we're exceeding the number of planets that we could use. We actually need more like 2 or 5 times as many planets as we have to have enough resources to consume this, to continue going. And we've already deeply exceeded what's sustainable for this single planet. The answer is actually simple enough. We need to enter a period of economic degrowth. And this is where, we start looking at the well-being of the planet, the well-being of human beings, and that becomes our primary concern rather than, GDP, gross domestic product. That's a trick to do, and economists all over the planet are trying to figure out how to do it. It's a formidable set of challenges, really, but we really have no choice. We can't continue to grow as a people, as a species and population, and continue to consume more and more. The two have to be seen as a relationship. So yes, we need to reduce the number of people on the planet, but consumption is the bigger problem here because people are consuming so much. We also have to address this, and ground zero, it all comes back to advertisers and what they're doing. So the next comment. Our mindset towards wanting more is becoming a serious problem. This reminded me of a trip I made to Nicaragua where I went to volunteer to build a school for a small community. It was there I learned how consumerism is making my life and others in developed countries worse. These people I was lucky to meet were happy and content, though with what little they had. The locals were always smiling and laughing at each other, which took me by surprise because in America, where we literally have everything these people don't, we find ourselves unhappy that we can't get the new iPhone or new clothes. These people in Nicaragua don't have money to buy one pair of shoes, yet they seem happier than us who have everything at our fingertips. This was just such an eye-opening experience, and hopefully we can change our mindsets that are wired to always want more. Yeah, so after manufacturing desire, it's such a great comment. Product advertisement also hold out a promise that they can satisfy the desire. That's the project. So once they get you having the desire, hey, isn't it just coincidental? We have a product that can satisfy that desire. It's worrisome that the desire doesn't exist before the corporations manufactured it. But this notion that they will fulfill the desire with the product on offer is problematic. If products really didn't satisfy our desires, then people who purchase the most if they really did, then people who purchase the most, right, should be the most satisfied. So people and to use this person's example, in the United States, rather than a country like Nicaragua, well, we should be happier, right? Because we have a lot of desires, but we can satisfy it more. And I think most people know deep down, I think you do, that consumerism doesn't make us happy. And there have been study after study regarding this. You think the more you can buy makes you happier, but that's not the answer. And there's actually an interesting study, you may have heard of this, I don't think I've told this group it before, where they give people, 2 groups of people, $100. So it's a sociologist study. And they tell one group, go ahead and during this day, 8 hours, buy whatever you want. You can go down to a store and buy it. You can buy it online. The only caveat is you have to spend that $100 on yourself. They told another group of people, here's $100, do whatever you want. The only thing is you have to spend it on other people. You have to either buy things for other people, friends, go walk down State Street and pass it out to people who are unhoused, take your friends out to a meal or something, but you can't buy it. You can't spend it on yourself. And you would assume if consumerism works the way consumerism works, that the people who had the $100 to spend on themselves would be happier. They've done this study again and again. The people who spend it on themselves, buy it for themselves, or are less happy. They're less happy at the end of that day. They're less happy a month or a year later when they're asked about the experience. But anyhow, this in a very dramatic fashion, I think this comment considers people who are largely untouched by consumerism, and we're accustomed to equate consumerism with happiness, but it's striking to see people who don't have a lot. So from the quote from the person who made this observation, it was an eye-opening experience, as largely stepping outside of consumer culture made it clear that it's not only failing to deliver on this promise to fulfill our desires and make us happy. In fact, it's even making us less happy than people that have very little. And I want to return to this toward the end of the course, but this has to be one of the great ironies of what's happening to this planet. We are, kind of destroying this planet, largely making it uninhabitable for our species in this desire, fulfilling this desire and trying to be happier, and it's just not working. So forget the fact that we're screwing the planet. I mean, that's a problem, but we're doing it to be happier, and it's not making us happier. People who live far more sustainably, and this person gives an example that they encounter directly, they are not any happier. They are not less happy than we are. In fact, they're happier. But I mean, to be very clear, this is not to say that people who are living in real poverty across the planet, shouldn't have their needs, and I mean needs here, met more successfully. Everyone, should have things like access to fresh water and sufficient food, and I would argue medical care and things of that sort too. But it's interesting because corporations like to think of these low to moderate income countries as, quote, emerging markets. You may have heard it. So we'll go back to our example of sugar water with Coca-Cola. The sale of sugar in low and middle income countries, only a quarter of what people drink is a commercial beverage. So, but in wealthy countries like the United States, these companies have done an extraordinary job of creating desire, because in the US, 75% of the beverages that people drink here are commercial products, which is remarkable because water is free in the US. It should be clear, water should be free everywhere, and it's definitely not, and that's a problem. But why do 3 out of 4 people need to be drinking these other beverages, most of which are in no way good for you at all? But the real frightening part, in a way, is the US shows the success of that model, but when a country becomes a little wealthier, then they're seen as these emerging markets, and companies like Coca-Cola sweep in. And India is a prime example. So Coca-Cola right now, realizing that people in India per capita are having more and more disposable income, Coke and all sorts of other companies are swooping in to provide people with what they don't need, which is some form of sugar water. And it's just remarkable. So, and if you look at the actual numbers, the average person in India makes 300 rupees per day, and that's for a man. And by the way, gender inequality is alive and well in the US and elsewhere. If you're a woman, female identified in India, you make not 300, but 200 rupees a day. Coke costs 34 rupees. So if you work a 10-hour day, and if you're a man, you literally need to work an hour a day to buy that 12-ounce Coke. And if you're a woman, you need to work an hour and 45 minutes a day to buy that 12-inch Coke. It's an astonishing, I mean, it has to be like one of the best success stories for marketers, because everyone has water, or should have water available, and yet they are incredibly successful at creating a desire for something that you just don't need. And in countries like Nicaragua may not be hit the way India is with it now. Other countries are. We can look at the statistics for example, Mexico and Coca-Cola and how successful they are there. But in India, I mean, you have to see how misguided this project is. In India, 76 million people are without fresh water in India. So, what should we be doing as the country becomes wealthier? We should be dealing with those major infrastructure deficiencies and making sure that everyone in India has safe drinking water. And yet, we're going in, companies are sweeping in to sell them stuff that they really don't need. Not safe drinking water, but sugar water that's, not good for anyone. Anyhow, next comment. This week's reading is very interesting in many aspects. It was written in the early 1960s, just as modern consumerism in the US was taking off. Now, I'm from China, and modern consumerism is also taking its root here at an extremely rapid pace in recent years. Therefore, this book has an even closer relationship to me. In the 21st century, this book can be a reflection of the past decades for the developed countries, i.e. the United States, which it is, but it can also act as a warning sign against the potential dangers of consumerism, not to the American people as it was in the 1960s, but to the developing countries today. It's a really great statement that gets to it. As I noted when I talked about Vance Packard, that people caught in the middle of cultural change can see it because they have an interesting vantage point, right? So Vance Packard, growing up in the Depression, didn't see people buying a lot of clothes. People will start buying more and more and more. And he's like, what's up with this? How did this happen? That happened in the United States, after the Second World War. But in other parts of the world, this is not something that happened a generation or two ago. This is happening right now. So I just gave the example of India with Coca-Cola, but with China, it's, consumerism is becoming more and more rampant there as well. So what's interesting to think about then, if you think about it, is that American corporations are in the business of selling to the American public all sorts of things, right? Cars, computers, music, whatever. But in a very general way, all those industries are selling something to the world, and that's the American dream. This idea of unbridled consumption, one product after another, whatever it is, whether you see if you're in a poor low-income country and you see a car on offer, that might be the thing, whether you see fashion or whether you just see, influencers from the US, principally like from California, you think that's the American dream. So that is what's being sold to the planet, and the planet, unfortunately, is buying it. So what if you think about it, not only did the US directly contribute more to the climate crisis than any other country on the planet, we've indirectly encouraged the rest of the world to do the same. We've exported this model of over-the-top, supersized consumption to the rest of the planet. In so doing, we're potentially multiplying the harm that we did just in this one little 4% of the population in the US, but now other countries are doing it as well. And we can, blame them, but when you think about it, we did it by establishing the model, and also we did it and continue to do it through the American corporations that are on those other parts of that are working on other parts of the planet. So the companies I said, whether it's Apple or Microsoft or Google, they all are attempting to make profits from other countries as well. Yeah, and if you think about it, then if the problem is the American dream, perhaps the thing that we need most to do is to reevaluate that dream, to create a new model for the rest of the world. First for ourselves, and this is where like minimalism and everything we're talking about comes in, but then to set that as a model for the rest of the world, because, the world is going to be destroyed by this US model unless we change it. Can we succeed in making a more sustainable way of life? And I don't know, but I mean, it seems to me that has to be one of the goals, because again, it's not just that we emitted 20% of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. We've encouraged everyone else to do the same, and they're doing it. So next comment. There are the soft, incessant commercials by youngsters here during their weekly 20 hours of television watching. And there are the breakable plastic toys, which teach them at an early age that everything in this world is replaceable. That's this comment quoting Vance Packard. It wasn't until I read this sentence that I realized that I grew up watching commercials that shaped my attitude toward consumerism. We all do. I can still remember the commercials in which an actor encourages us to purchase their